Welcome, all of you happy warriors, you eager devotees of this Rabbi Daniel Lapin show, spiritually grounded in everything that is life-affirming, devoted to your faith, your families, your finances, and your friends, knowing that you can triumph over those who both intentionally and also unknowingly promote a dark abyss of satanic secular socialism, as well as all the many sick social pathologies that it generates. When I promise to reveal how the world really works, it is in the hope that you will help defeat those pathetic creatures of modern secular fundamentalism, those orphans in history who possess neither Christian fortitude nor even pagan ferocity, which would almost be welcome. Those hideous hermaphrodites running our media, education, government bureaucracies. They who possess neither the strength of men nor the intuitive wisdom of women, but oh, what damage they manage to inflict. Never fear. Here on the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, I solemnly commit to help you transform your timidity to triumph. Yes, together we will replace diffidence with determination and displace the divided counsels of doubt with the steady eyes and firm hearts of those who, just like us, know where they are going and, what is more, know they're going to get there. We strive for success, first with our families, and then with our finances, and then with our friends. And only after that will we be ready to take on the formidable task of saving our frighteningly fragile civilization from those who would force us to surrender our freedoms and our souls to the whims and dictates of those who consider themselves to be our superiors, our elites, our betters, our bosses, our rulers. But before we change the world, we have to change ourselves. Before we make the world a better place, we have to make our homes and businesses better places. And then our efforts and our dreams become leveraged, and together we achieve so much more. The two sure ways of building a bridge over the dark abyss of mortality is by building a family and building our finances. Now, this show would, of course, be far more dramatic if I could proudly proclaim how we are going to throw ourselves into the task of overturning the tyranny of the Veterans Administration, the Post Office, Amtrak, defying the dictators of the IRS, pulling down the venal and self-interested politicians on the national and the state levels, batter the bureaucrats into submission, and generally take to the ramparts. But only very rarely do these kinds of populist revolutions bring happy endings. Here we should help one another instead, build the basic interpersonal institutions of civilized society, families and homes, businesses and civic organizations. And so by building up our lives and those of our family and friends, little by little, we change the culture and the country, one heart at a time. And one thoroughly unsustainable indulgence, widely practiced by those who don't care about the future, is infidelity, adultery, philandering, fooling around. I mean, really, how long can a healthy society sustain marital cheating all around the countryside? I'm sure you would agree that the actions of people who cheat, people who practice infidelity, people who betray their marriage vows, they're hurting everybody. They're polluting the cultural environment. They are imperiling every aspect of the next generation. And so, in order to help those people, I feel it only fair to have a system of infidelity offsets. And I believe that it is the public service of the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show to make it possible to do just that. And so we pass the word around, naturally, not to you, my loyal listeners, for you are surely upright citizens, but out there in the culture, among 300 million fellow Americans, and among countless millions of people beyond the shores of the United States of America, there are people who cheat. There are people who philander. There are people who fornicate and betray their marriage vows. And in order to diminish the damage that they do, here on the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, we are determined to sell infidelity offsets. Now, the way this works is that we are going to seek out around the country all of those people who agree to remain single and chaste, or people who are married and utterly monogamous, and we are going to send them a portion of the money that cheaters and philanderers send to us to buy offsets. We will send them a portion of the payment in order to encourage them to remain celibate if single, or monogamous and loyal if married. And so that way, it is possible that those people who do cheat are able to neutralize that cheating. We're going to build a vast global network of fidelity. And by submitting your payment, you cheaters out there, by submitting your payment to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, you are helping to fund monogamy. You are helping to boost what we call monogamy offset projects. Because you may be cheating, but at least you are purchasing loyalty offsets. And we invest a portion of the money that you pay us. We invest it in monogamous couples, faithful people, or even single people who remain chaste and celibate, to encourage them to remain that way. It seems to me an absolutely perfect system. Because, after all, if it works so spectacularly well for carbon offsets, if you can, after all, perform some horribly destructive, unsustainable action like flying on an airplane, you can add to the cost of your ticket a carbon offset, which enables the community-minded and altruistic organization behind it to invest a portion of your money in sustainable projects and in planting trees. Well, we feel we can do exactly the same in order to make it possible for cheating and infidelity to be somewhat diminished in the terms of the damage they cause to the culture. You cheaters know that while you may be embarking on an extramarital affair, you can take comfort in knowing that you have purchased a cheating offset, that for every act of infidelity that you perform, for every affair in which you indulge, you may take spiritual and moral comfort in knowing that for every one of those acts of betrayal, we will invest in people who are supporting marriage, maintaining marriage, and striking a blow in favor of traditional morality when it comes to sex. What do you say? Is that a plan or is that not a plan? I am sure that you see the intrinsic wisdom, because after all, just as it makes sense to protect our environment from the ravages of carbon pollution, which will help those oceanfront dwellers on Long Island and in Key Biscayne, it'll save, not to mention Malibu, it'll save them from the rising seawater, which is such an inevitable consequence of all this carbon. And so if you're going to do something as sinful as spreading carbon into the atmosphere, know that you are offsetting it by doing something good, by allowing organizations to invest your expiation money. Your expiation money, I like that, in a carbon neutral or carbon destroying process. Well, we'll do exactly the same in order to limit the moral pollution of adultery, because we will invest a portion of your expiation money paid by money order, check, or PayPal to us. We will invest it in celibacy, monogamy, and marital vows. It's a great deal, isn't it? You can't possibly ignore it, and I thoroughly expect you to help promote this among people you may know, so as to allow them to embark on affairs and to embrace adultery, knowing that they are limiting the evil that they are doing in exactly the same way that people can throw their towels on the floor of the hotel bathroom, compelling the hotel to change those towels every day, and to put the little sign on your pillow that says, "I demand that you change my sheets every day." You can do that with a free conscience, knowing that you are purchasing your carbon offsets. Well, I will explain just a little more where this is all headed, and we talk about April the 22nd. Earth Day? No! April the 22nd, the birthday of Lenin, the father of modern communism. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Meanwhile, over to my website, where you are able to purchase cheating offsets, adultery offset, no. Carbon offset, no. Where you are able to add wisdom to your financial management with 2 discounted audio downloads, things you can get right away. One is called Boost Your Income, 3 Spiritual Success Strategies, very, very important. And the other is twice as long. It's called Prosperity Power, Connect for Success. Anybody who feels that they do not have the number of contacts and friends they'd like to have, anyone who feels a little shy and a little diffident, people who feel introverted, this is the audio program you need, or you need to get for people in those positions. Both of these have a lot to do with, have everything to do with increasing your financial revenue. So over to my website, RabbiDanielLappin.com, RabbiDanielLappin.com, where you will look out for Boost Your Income and Connect for Success. I'm Rabbi Daniel Lappin, and on to Lenin's birthday. Your Rabbi reveals how the world really works. And one way the world really works is to recognize that human beings have needs. Just as we have needs for oxygen and for water, we also have needs that are intangible. And that's because we're not just bodies, we are souls as well. We have spiritual needs as well as we have physical needs. And while the physical needs like oxygen and water are perfectly obvious, and elicit an instantaneous and meaningful response, our spiritual needs are often camouflaged. And there are many, many people who never discover what ails them. If you're short of oxygen, you feel yourself becoming asphyxiated, and you do everything you can to solve that problem. The trouble is that if the spiritual needs we have are being withheld from you, it's not as if your body starts immediately pulling you towards that commodity. What happens is that you start manifesting the disease of spiritual stifling. You start manifesting the problems of people who are not having their spiritual needs attended to. And I'm going to explain a whole lot more on that as we go along. So just remember that idea that, yes, we all do have spiritual needs as powerful as our needs for water and oxygen. And these needs take certain forms that placate our spiritual yearnings. I'll come back to that. But first of all, let's talk for just a moment about Earth Day. All right, Earth Day started in 1970, and the date was chosen of April the 22nd. Now, there was a Democratic senator from Wisconsin by the name of Gaylord Nelson, who played a whole important role in that, and who subsequently has written and said, people think my choosing of that day was because it was the birthday of, well, you and I both know this is the birthday of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He was born in 1870, and he died in 1924, and he was essentially the founder of the Soviet Union. He was the person he didn't invent communism, neither did Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, but he took the idea of communism and realized it was something he could use to self-aggrandize, to build himself up, and to make his ladder to prominence and prosperity. So Gaylord Nelson wants us to believe that the date was, just a casual thing. Let me take you to Gaylord Nelson's book. He wrote a silly book called Beyond Earth Day, Fulfilling the Promise. And here's what he said. I'm reading now, and I know it sounds boring when I read, but I'll do my best to not have it that way. I usually don't like reading anything on the show because the same reason I never like reading a speech. And I personally, for one, when I see a speaker take a wad of notes out and lay them out on the podium, I find it very hard not to drift off to sleep, or at very least to drift off into a daydream. Somehow or another, when a person speaks extemporaneously, it grants me a glimpse into his soul. That's exciting, to get to know another person, right? It's one of the reasons that the biblical usage for sexual intercourse of to know somebody is not a euphemism. It's not just a polite way because the Bible doesn't want to say sexual intercourse, which it does in many places. But when it says Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, it is introducing us to this idea that knowing another human being is about the biggest thrill it's possible for a person to get. And obviously getting to know a woman sexually is for a man an ultimate thrill, but even getting to know another human being non-sexually, but through verbal intercourse, if you like, that also is an exciting thing. The minute somebody gives a speech by reading, and this is something that a certain former president of the United States made a specialty of, just reading his speeches. As a matter of fact, you can see numerous videos on YouTube that show what he does when the teleprompter breaks, and he babbles incoherently for a few moments until they actually get it running once again. That's a bad sign, right? Either he's frightened to reveal his soul, or there's just not much there. That's another possibility. So reading speech is always a bad idea. And on the show like this, reading, again, all by way of explaining why I'm about to read something from Gaylord Nelson's book called Beyond Earth Day, Fulfilling the Promise, so you'll pardon me. He writes the following: I was satisfied that if we could tap into the environmental concerns of the general public and infuse the student anti-war energy into the environmental cause, we could generate a demonstration that would force this issue onto the national political agenda. It was a big gamble, but worth a try. Boring. At a September 1969 conference in Seattle, I announced that in the spring of 1970 there would be a nationwide grassroots demonstration on behalf of the environment, and I invited everyone to participate. The date, April the 22nd, was chosen because it was before the summer recess for grade schools and high schools, and it avoided exam time on college campuses. I believe the support of these groups would be critical to any successful demonstration on behalf of the environment. That turned out to be a good guess. The date aroused the suspicion of the conservative John Birch Society, however, which perceived some sinister communist plot was underway. Within a week of the announcement that April 22nd would be Earth Day, the society charged that the event was Senator Nelson's ill-concealed attempt to honor the 100th birthday of Vladimir Lenin. Anyways, all right, so he says, this coincidence of timing continued to pop up here and there. The day before the first Earth Day, the Los Angeles City Council adopted an Earth Day resolution by one vote over the objection of a member who argued against passing such a resolution on Lenin's birthday, and so on and so forth. And then he goes on, methinks the man doth protest too much, because he carries on for nearly a page on how April 22nd being chosen as Earth Day was simply a coincidence. Look, I know that they didn't have Google and the internet back in 1969, but they did have encyclopedias in every library. And they also had books called This Day in History, just as we have websites now, This Day in History. And you can Google April 22nd or go to This Day in History, whatever you want to do. Anywhere you look up April the 22nd, it will tell you Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, born April 22nd, 1870. The notion that you're going to set a nationwide demonstration for the environment, and you're going to select a day for this nationwide demonstration for the environment, and you're not even going to check to see if there might be something else happening on that day that you don't want to be associated. I just don't believe it. It's simply not on. It's not a possibility. Also, it's impossible that they could not have known that in 1955, Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, designated April the 22nd as the International Day for celebrating communism. It's not possible. Just not possible. So you have to know that I totally reject the notion that April the 22nd for Earth Day was selected with absolutely no notice whatsoever of the fact that it was a terribly important day for communism. Okay? Not a mistake. Really not a mistake. And again, as I said, even if somebody could completely unrealistically not discover, I don't believe that you can choose a date and not, look, people don't set party dates without checking to see if there isn't something that happened on that day that could become a mockery or a joke. You don't do that. A nationwide demonstration for the environment, they check the date. They know that Nikita Khrushchev made it a day of international celebration of communism. They know that it was the 100th birthday of Lenin. They knew that very, very well indeed. So there, in 1970, 100 years exactly to the day after the birth of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, they created something called Earth Day. And I think what we should recognize that there are certain similarities. I don't think I'm going too far when I say that when communism arrived with the work of Lenin in Russia in 1917, one of the very first things it did was to outlaw private property. Okay, there's a reason for that. right? There's a reason that the ownership of property and money is vital for freedom, and that if you are trying to create a communist tyranny, you have to prevent citizens from owning private property. Sure, that's absolutely right. And under communism, the state owns all property. This is true in Cuba. It was true in the Soviet Union, and you could not own property. The only exception in the Soviet Union was when they had famines. They discovered that tiny little privately owned food, little tiny land holdings, little farms produced disproportionate amounts of the food. Every state-owned farming enterprise failed and collapsed. These tiny, small number of family-owned little farms, they survived, they produced food. So the only exception was simply to stave off national starvation. Russia allowed a few of these small private farms to exist, but otherwise people own the state owns everything. I should mention that since April 22nd, 1970, the government has gone way overboard in declaring millions and millions of acres of property into national monuments. So, in other words, land that could be bought by farmers, land that could be bought by private citizens, land that should be able to be purchased by Americans was made off limits. And of course, this was to protect the environment, and everybody cheered, oh, how wonderful this was. And the most recent former president, during his 8 years, handed over or took truly millions upon millions of acres of private property and turned it into national owned property. Sometimes he did it to prevent drilling, sometimes he did it to but basically the philosophy is the more land the government owns, the better off it is. Okay? The whole idea of the United States was the opposite, and we thrived and prospered precisely because of that. And so you should know that if you take the land mass of the United States, including Hawaii and Alaska, do you have any idea of what percentage the government owns of that? Government owns about, no, I'm not going to say about, 50%. Do you know how much that is? What possible reason? It's not even all national parks, by the way. It's not even as if we all have access. We can go camping and hiking in these places. No, a lot of them are off limits. They're off limits to use of any kind, to development of any kind. And 50% of the land of the United States America belongs to the government. And all of this has happened. The overwhelming majority of it has happened since 1970. Earth Day has helped to make this happen. You should know that Congress continues to consider funding large sums of money to make it possible for states to purchase even more property, to put it off limits to private citizens. Don't forget there is something called the Fifth Amendment, which protects the right of citizens to own property. You know what the Founding Fathers thought of this. And the Fifth Amendment says that no private property may be taken for public use without just compensation. However, around the United States, government has taken private property. The Endangered Species Act has been a very, very damaging on this, and many of the other acts. Wetlands legislation has been appallingly damaging. This stuff is really, really bad because the philosophy of the environmental movement and the philosophy of totalitarian governments, they're very, very close. The connections are compelling. And there's no question about it that one of the great ways to undermine the economy of the United States of America is to deny its citizens the benefits of its natural resources. It's terrible. You should also know that over 30% of all federal laws and regulations, and I mean, you know how many federal laws and regulations that, well, you don't, nobody does, but you know that it's huge. 30+% of all federal laws and regulations have to do with protecting the environment. They impact property ownership, they impact the use of energy sources, enormous parts of the United States that have huge reserves of oil and coal and natural gas are off limits. It's very difficult today for a structure to be built without an environmental impact study being forced to be done. And on and on it goes. On and on it goes. I don't want to quote from another book, but Al Gore, you might remember, wrote a book called Earth in the Balance. It is a piece of unadulterated bilge water. But he does write in there, I quote, the central organizing principle means that we must embark on an all-out effort to use every policy and program, every law and institution, every treaty and alliance, every tactic and strategy, every plan and course of action, to use, in short, every means to halt the destruction of the environment. Okay. All right. Well, this is bad stuff. I think you'll agree. This is really very, very bad stuff. I should also mention that Gaylord Nelson speaks very explicitly about the idea that the environment is more important than the economy. This is repeated again and again and again. The economy must be subservient to the environment. Folks, if you were a communist giant brain and you spent 10 years in a think tank with people with 180 IQ to come up with the best way to damage the United States of America, you could not have come up with a better idea than the environmental movement, including climate change, and Earth Day, April the 22nd, 1970. Over to the website, rabbidaniellapin.com. And I will let you know that in case you hadn't realized by now, right, you may be tired, you may be listening only with half an ear, and perhaps you thought that my infidelity offset program was for real. Maybe you actually were starting to write out a check. It goes without saying that it was nothing than a weak attempt at farce and satire. I was, of course, mocking the whole carbon offset movement, how Leonardo DiCaprio, well, all right, enough said. He has become a high priest of environmentalism and buys a lot of carbon offsets so he can use his private jet. Okay. Well, that's all I was trying to do, mock it. So, no, please do not send in any money. Do not go to my website to purchase infidelity offsets. There are none to be had. However, I urge you to please, yes, go to my website and purchase a copy of Boost Your Income, 3 Spiritual Strategies for Success, and a copy of Connect for Success, Prosperity Power, How to Connect for Success, and these will bring you a whole lot more benefit than infidelity offsets, I guarantee it. And if you already have them, or if you know somebody who could use a complete reset of their financial plan for the rest of this year, then this would be a very inexpensive gift. Go ahead and get it. If you get the download, by the way, I really don't mind you sharing it with folks. I just don't. I want it to get out, so you won't find any locks on it that prevent you sharing it with anyone else. You may feel free to go ahead and share it with your nearest and dearest. I mentioned a little earlier, and I just want to remind you that about a third, over 30%, of all the rules and governmental regulations in the United States have to do with the environment. And the act that makes all of that possible was called the Environmental Protection Act, and the agency that was started by executive order on the part of Richard Nixon. Now, I'm not saying that Richard Nixon wanted to destroy the United States of America. He didn't, and he was a patriotic American. He had his flaws. But he was a terrific president. He really was, in many, many ways. I mean, let's say that there were a lot of things he did very right. One of the things he did very wrong was an executive order that that created the agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. He did it as a dupe. Don't forget, this happened in December 1970, the first Earth Day, to enormous hoopla promoted by Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, Democrat. And by the way, at the time, nobody said, how dare you use your Senate staff? How dare you raise money? How can you, as a sitting U.S. Senator, how can you do a thing like that? Nobody even said it, because it was such a clever cause that people just said, well, of course, it's a wonderful thing. Nobody questioned. And nobody on Richard Nixon's staff said to him, Mr. President, with respect, this may not be such a good idea. Earth Day, not necessarily in the interests of the United States of America. The Environmental Protection Agency, maybe not the best idea. One can but pray that President Donald Trump will severely clip the wings of the EPA. There has been so much reduction in the freedom of Americans as a result of environmental laws that it can only be good for much of that to be sunsetted and much of it to be clipped away. Nelson, again, Senator Gaylord Nelson, said in these words, "The bigger the population gets, the more serious the problems become. We have to address the population issue. The United Nations, with the United States supporting it, took the position in Cairo in 1994 that every country was responsible for stabilizing its own population." Yeah, like Cairo, Egypt is stabilizing its population, right? Anyway, it can be done, said Gaylord Nelson. It can be done, but in this country, it's phony to say, I'm for the environment, but not for limiting immigration. Isn't that beautiful? The father of American environmentalism, Senator Gaylord Nelson, was the one who he himself said, if you're for the environment, you have to oppose immigration. So I am for the environment, and boy, do I oppose immigration. But wait a second. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I must tell you that you've got to be aware of the kind of chicanery pulled by the left. I was listening to National Public Radio the other day, 2 days ago, and they ran a program on the benefits of immigration. And what they did is they listed all these wonderful companies founded by immigrants, including Google, by the way. And so I quickly pulled out a pen and one of my index cards that is always in my upper left-hand pocket on my shirt. I hate shirts without pockets on the front there because that's where my index cards live. And I quickly wrote down the names of every company that they listed. You see, this is why immigration benefits the United States of America. We wouldn't have these companies adding to the prosperity of the cows. Oh, wonderful. Not a single one of those entrepreneurs was Muslim. Wouldn't you have thought that in the interests of intellectual honesty, shouldn't National Public Radio have said, we tried, but we couldn't find any companies around the United States that were worth talking about started by Muslims? To them, immigrants are immigrants. And why is that? Because they utterly and totally reject the notion that a person's religion shapes his outlook and his behavior. They wouldn't accept that. They regard religion as utterly insignificant. Who cares what a person's religion is? I mean, most people are secular. Most people don't have any religion. Those who do don't treat it seriously. That's what they think. And this is why they will not speak about Islamic terrorism, because that Islam is a religion. So they'll speak about immigrants, and I'll speak about people from Afghanistan, but never identifying by religion. Because, of course, nobody's behavior is shaped by religion. And the trouble is they are enormously impacted by Jewish influence, where the vast majority of Jews are not impacted by their faith. I've spoken about this before, and it's an enormous problem. It's something that, as a rabbi, I do take as a personal failure that I have not done more to be able to change this. But the fact is that you would have thought that if somebody says, I'm Jewish, that this would say something about his belief system. In the same way that if somebody says, I'm a Christian, you kind of get a basic idea that the person accepts Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. I mean, that's not difficult, right? It's more than likely the case. But if somebody says, I'm Jewish, you can literally draw zero conclusions about their belief system. They might even be an atheist. That's what's crazy. And because of Jewish influence in the culture, the belief has grown that religion is insignificant and utterly irrelevant to whatever behavior or belief system a person might have. And so, for that reason, National Public Radio felt very comfortable saying, oh, look, we found all these immigrant started companies that are good for America, so we must let in all the immigrants who want to come to us from Syria and from Iraq and from Afghanistan and from Somalia. Sure, anyone who wants to come, because immigrants are good for this country. And they cannot say, wait a second, immigrants from India have been terrific for this country. Immigrants from Western Europe, German immigrants, have been great for this country. But there is a problem with Muslim immigrants. All of them? No, of course not. But a very significant proportion of them. That means we need to stop and take a look. It's not all immigrants, it's Muslim immigrants. Well, back in 1994, no less an authority than Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin said, we've got to stop immigration. We must limit immigration if we're for the environment. By the way, Gaylord Nelson, again, the father of modern Earth Day, also rejected the idea that economic development should take precedence over environmental protection. The way he put it was, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the other way around. And again, look, if somebody would say to me, well, look, I'm gasping for breath, I've got no water to drink, so obviously the environment has to come ahead of economic development, I say, yeah, sure, I agree, I understand. But for anyone who's not gasping for breath and anyone who has plenty water to drink, the idea that economic development can be made subservient to a highly questionable philosophy, no. It's shocking that a man who was appointed to the United States Congress could use his resources on promoting this incredibly destructive concept. When Gaylord Nelson is trying to sort of build up funding for Earth Day, he writes again in his book, Beyond Earth Day, Fulfilling the Promise. When I planned the first Earth Day, only one major corporation contributed to our national effort, Arm and Hammer. Corporate leadership there was far ahead of the times. He was such an idiot. Didn't he know that Arm and Hammer was owned by the communist sympathizer Arm and Hammer? That's right. You can still go to Westwood in Los Angeles, and on Wilshire Boulevard, just off Wilshire, you will see the Arm and Hammer Art Museum. Occidental Petroleum was a company owned by Arm and Hammer and used as a vehicle for funding problematic groups in the United States, particularly the anti-war movement from the KGB. Am I crazy? No, I'm not. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It really warrants an entire show all of its own. But I should mention that the Gores, Al Gore and his dad, Al Gore Sr., Tennessee senators and a vice president, Al Gore Jr., that is, extensively spoke about We must transform society. We've got to centralize government control of land. I mean, these guys really believed that. And it's not a coincidence that throughout his career, Al Gore Sr. was supported financially to the tune of millions of dollars by who? Arm & Hammer, the founder of Occidental Petroleum. And by the way, somebody who was known as a Soviet agent in the 1920s. No secret. Hammer actually was awarded an award by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin as the Communist Party official path to the resources of American capitalism. He was the only American ever to receive one of the highest honors ever bestowed by the former Soviet Union. When Albert Gore Sr. was defeated in a re-election bid, I forget the year, he actually became a very highly paid executive in, would you be shocked to hear, Occidental Petroleum? That's right, Arm & Hammer's company. The same company that gave Gaylord Nelson money for the first Earth Day. Coincidence? If you believe that, I am disappointed. Then it only can mean you've not been listening to this show for nearly long enough. You should also know that the Gores, Albert Gore Sr. and Jr., hosted Hammer. He was their personal guest. Arm & Hammer was their guest at the inaugurations of both Kennedy and Johnson. Al Gore Sr. literally navigated Arm & Hammer's access to Libyan oil, and Al Gore Jr. was instrumental in enabling Occidental Petroleum to get hold of land formerly owned by the United States. Oddly enough, for reasons that make perfect sense to me, the FBI files on Arm & Hammer are sealed, and I'm not sure what it would take to access them. Anyway, that gives you a little bit of an idea of the shenanigans going on behind the scenes. Earth Day 1970, environmentalism, yes, genuinely a program to hurt America. And I'll tell you a little bit more as we delve more deeply into the destructiveness of environmentalism. For now, the website, rabbidaniellapin.com. If you have any questions, we have an Ask the Rabbi feature, and you can also go back and read hundreds of questions that people have asked us. They've always been questions having to do with real life. We don't answer theological questions. We don't answer biblical questions. We use a biblical lens to answer questions that people have about friendship, about faith, about family, about money, and all of that is in the Ask the Rabbi pages of the rabbidaniellapin.com website. It's also a place where you can read back issues of Thought Tools, of Susan's Musings, and it's a place you can send us a letter. You can also, please, take a look, and you will read up, and if it pleases you, which I think it will, you need to buy yourself a copy right away while the discount is still active of the audio program Boost Your Income and the second audio program Prosperity Power, Connect for Success. It's good stuff. It's powerful stuff and very effective stuff. Yes, the more that things change, the more we need to depend upon those things that never change. And the fatal and seductive allure of communism is something that'll never change. It always has been a part of the human experience. It really has. And those of you who are regular listeners have heard me talk about it. You may even already own a copy of The Tower of Power, Decoding the Secrets of Babel, in which I explain how 9 verses at the beginning of chapter 11 of Genesis reveal the deepest desires latent in the human soul. For what? Communism. That's right. It wasn't called communism back then, but think of it as secular fundamentalism. That is the philosophy that produces the political system called communism. And one of the things that you also would probably know if you're a regular listener is that I recently conducted a Passover Freedom Conference for about 300 Jewish families who convened for a week in a hotel and conference center near Niagara Falls on the Canadian side. And I think I spoke about on the show, I think I spoke about the extraordinary grandeur of Niagara Falls, which I'd never seen before, and how overwhelmed I felt by this extraordinary display of, well, nature, right? God's nature. Well, that's part of the problem, of course. I also was planning on bringing back from Canada with me a few boxes of 100-watt incandescent light bulbs. Now, because I don't want to publicly confess to any crime, I'm not going to tell you whether I actually succeeded or failed in my quest. But I will tell you that if I had space, I would also have brought back a proper flushing toilet or two and a few shower heads that didn't restrict the water flow. I would have done all of that. I deeply resent the government passing a law that incandescent light bulbs cannot be sold in the United States of America. I believe that if incandescent light bulbs are if LED bulbs are so much better and so much more efficient, the market would have taken care of it, right? Business people are not stupid. They would have started making them, leaving consumers like me free to make a choice. Would I rather spend 79 cents on an incandescent bulb that'll last for 1,500 hours and shed a warm, comfortable yellow glow, and that would work easily with inexpensive dimmers? Or would I like to spend $9 to $15 for an LED or fluorescent bulb that needs a very expensive dimmer in order to operate, and which throws a harsh, cold light that I do not find in the slightest bit attractive? The market could have taken care of it. Government intrusion, just one more way in which environmental hysteria has enabled the government to diminish the freedoms of ordinary Americans. And my being unable to purchase an incandescent light bulb, I assure you, is the least of the problems that environmentalism is causing America. Let me give you an example of how there is no limit to the insanity that will be able to be justified under this evil doctrine. There are two scientists at Oregon State University. One's called Paul Murtaugh and the other's Michael Slacks. And they released a study a few years ago called Reproduction and the Carbon Legacies of Individuals. So let me just make clear what they're saying. If you care about the environment, it's not enough to get rid of your incandescent light bulbs. No, you need to start restricting the number of children you have. One child is too many. You got to know, they say, and they warn very ominously, every human being is responsible for the future carbon emissions of his descendants. Whoa! How about every human being responsible for the great inventions of his descendants, the great discoveries of his descendants, the wonderful human beings that his descendants become? No, you are responsible for the carbon emissions of your descendants. And Murtaugh and Slick say an American woman who is admirably environmental, they say they expect her to recycle, energy-efficient windows, she drives a Prius and only very little, but by merely having 2 children, which, by the way, is a problem because that's below replacement level, by only having 2 children, she will add nearly 40 times the amount of carbon dioxide emissions she had saved with all those lifestyle changes. The only way, they say, to save the planet is to tie your tubes. Look, I couldn't make this stuff up. There was a guy who was a scientific advisor to the president. a real idiot. A real idiot. His name was John Holdren. And he too said in 1973, 210 million Americans now is too many, and 280 million in 2040 is far too many. We have to encourage women to have fewer children. It's pretty bad stuff. In the British Medical Journal, okay, in this case they're talking not about American babies but about British babies, and this is a medical journal, for heaven's sake. This is not an environmental journal. In a medical journal, and it's a prestigious medical journal, to just give you an idea of how far this evil philosophy has percolated. The British Medical Journal carries an article, and if you're interested, by the way, it would have been in July 2009. They run an article that each new birth in the United Kingdom will result in 160 times more greenhouse gas emissions than a new birth in Ethiopia. So what they're saying is, and you've heard this said again, right? Well, you're trying to make us stop having babies here, but they're not limiting the number of babies in Ethiopia. Good point. And so this answers and says, no, English babies will use 160 times more greenhouse gas emissions than Ethiopian babies. British couples must be told that having fewer children is the simplest and biggest gift that anyone can make to a habitable planet. Britain must promote environmental ethics, where having fewer children is just like having fewer patio heaters and fewer high-carbon cars. Look, this is pretty amazing. Round about the 1970s, where, at the time when Earth Day was being started, April 22nd, 1970, there was back then also a lot of talk about too many babies. But right now, the focus is that an American mom who brings a new life into the world is a much bigger menace to the environment than a Bangladeshi mother who does this. And certainly any Islamic mother who brings new babies into the world, that's only good. But American mothers, no, you're threatening the planet. Okay, so you may as well just begin to wrap yourself around the idea that environmentalism is pervasive, it's a destructive ideology, and it is very difficult, extremely difficult, to combat. I admit this. To defeat the destruction of environmentalism is very, very challenging. But there's much more. You all heard the famous lie, have you not? 97% of scientists agree that climate change is a terrible threat and must be solved, otherwise it's going to cause untold calamities before the day after tomorrow. Right? You've all heard that, right? Look, you don't need me to tell you that science is not established by consensus or by vote. It just isn't. And, there was a time where you could have said 97. By the way, the 97% figure is complete nonsense. But even if 97% of scientists did, do you know that in the closing years of the 1800s, closing years of the 19th century, the overwhelming majority of scientists held that a certain model of the atom was correct. It turns out it was completely wrong. But I guarantee you not only 97% of scientists, but 100% of scientists thought that. And that was, it was up till about 1900, because that was the year that the great Lord Kelvin, who was, the Lord Kelvin, I mean, the Kelvin temperature scale is named after him. He was a lord because of his scientific expertise. He said, quote, and this is true, I mean, this he really did say, there is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. And he said that while people still had the wrong idea of an atom. Namely, people still believed that an atom looked like a blueberry muffin, right, with electrons scattered around and protons scattered around like blueberries in the muffin. They had no idea yet of the orbital model of the atom, which we now believe to be true. So you could have said that not only Lord Kelvin, but nearly 100% of scientists believed something which only a few years later was going to be shattered by Albert Einstein, by Hermann Minkowski, and some of the others of the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And so the notion that everything in science is up for debate, everything in science is up for re-examination and for challenge, except global warming, except climate change, except environmentalism. That is settled science. And I'm going to make the case that it's not science, but it's religion. And one of the proofs of it is that they've adopted the use of the word denial. They call them climate deniers, global warming deniers. That term deniers was traditionally used for heretics of religion, people who denied the omniscience of the Lord. They were deniers. And so, never before in the history of science has anybody who challenged an existing science theory be called a denier. On the contrary, when you challenge a popularly held theory, you are good. Real scientists turn to you and say, okay, go for it. Tell us what you think. Show us. Give us something replicable. Bring up an experiment that we can all do. But the exception, global warming, how dare you challenge it? And a number of scientific careers have been destroyed because people in professorships, people in prestigious positions at the Smithsonian would not sign on to this scam of environmentalism and climate change. They lost their jobs over this. So much for it being scientific. No, people are not in the slightest bit interested in science. This is all about religion, and we need to understand what and why, and I'm going to do my very best to tell you. I'm Rabbi Daniel Lapin. My website is rabbidaniellapin.com, where you can go ahead right now and order yourself a copy of Boost Your Income, which will do for you exactly what it says. And if your income's doing just fine, maybe you have a family member or a relative, maybe a friend who really could use to boost their income. You also want a copy of Prosperity Power, Connect for Success. In total, you're looking at 3 hours of instruction on finance, material you do need to hear more than once. Hence, I ask you to go ahead and download it, put it on your phone or your iPad, put it wherever you want, so as you can hear it on a regular basis. That would be great. RabbiDanielLapin.com. The products are Boost Your Income and Prosperity Power. They are at they're always at a very affordable price. There's an even bigger discount on it right now, and you can go ahead and make a difference in the financial life of your family or someone else's. So please go ahead and do that. It's a way of supporting my work as well as doing yourself a favor. How can I do anything other but make God smile? Which is what I hope I'm doing. I also hope I make you smile just a little bit here on the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, where your rabbi reveals how the world really works. That's right. And one of the ways the world really works is that it's very hard to drive long distances. Many of you commute. Sometimes you take road trip vacations. And while you're in the car, in order to help stay awake and alert driving, obviously the best thing you should be doing is listening to Rabbi Daniel Lapin audio programs. And two that I strongly endorse right now are Boost Your Income, and the second one, Prosperity Power, Connect for Success. The first one is an hour, the second is about 2 hours, nearly 3 hours in total, available on special deal right now at rabbidaniellapin.com. Why do I mention it? Because what happens if you've got a road trip coming up and you want something a little less heavy, something that you don't have to concentrate on quite as much? Well, I would recommend, first of all, I would recommend something which has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with our discussion, namely The Great Train Robbery, which is available in an audio book. It might even be available from your local library in the form of CDs. Borrow them, take them with you on the trip. It's by Michael Crichton, the great writer, the late Michael Crichton, and it's about a train robbery in England in the 19th century, and with considerable literary license, but it is based on a true story. But it's a gripping, beautifully done story, and it'll make the miles just zip by. But I mentioned that only in order to be able to tell you there's another book by Michael Crichton that is not only even more thrilling, but actually useful because it's apropos of the topic we're discussing, letting you know that, yes, environmentalism is not harmless. It's certainly not good. It's not even harmless. It's actually damaging and destructive. It is an evil pathology and an incredibly destructive philosophy. Michael Crichton's book is called State of Fear. And, it's been out for a bunch of years. You shouldn't have any trouble getting hold of it if you're interested. But it's a really fast-moving sort of techno-political thriller. Global warming, it's all about global warming. Well, polar ice caps melting and calamitous messes and flooding and so on and so forth. The book starts off with a murder of an American graduate studying ocean wave dynamics, and a guy selling submarines is murdered, and there's another guy buying. And Michael Crichton's an absolute master of setting this kind of plot. And anyway, all the skullduggery going on is being coordinated by a guy who's meant to be Ralph Nader. His name is Nick Drake in the book, but he's obviously Ralph Nader. Intense, single-minded, and somewhat unhinged. And he's the president of an organization called the National Environmental Resource Fund, etc., etc. And I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but there's a scientist in it, an MIT scientist, and people get murdered, and it really has a lot to recommend it. I sort of want to encourage you to read it or listen to it when you're driving without telling you too much about it. But essentially what the book is saying is environmentalism has nothing to do with science. It is an intense, fanatical belief system. It's a religion. It's not based on fact. It's based on faith. And Michael Crichton had a very strong grip on the scientific data and reality, and he talks about it. I mean, you'll come across the Sierra Club and the Union of Concerned Scientists, and you'll come across all the people in one form or another you've been reading about for years. And in the book, for instance, the MIT scientist, Dr. Kenner, correctly notes that Greenland's ice cap is in no danger of melting away. By the way, it's well known that Greenland's average temperatures have been falling at about the rate of 2 degrees centigrade per decade, which is quite a lot. It's getting colder, not warmer. Nothing is melting. As far as the southern pole is concerned, temperatures throughout Antarctica have been falling for over 50 years. Ice has been accumulating rather than melting. What about all those pictures of shrinking ice with dying polar bears? All fake, all bogus. How about all the low-lying islands in the Pacific that are being flooded by rising sea levels? No rise in sea level at all. There's evidence of a fall in sea level over the past 20 years. Global average temperatures, which is a key part of the whole book of State of Fear, planet been warming up at 0.08 degrees Celsius every 10 years. Arithmetic shows that with this trend, the planet will rise by 0.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's not even 1 degree. That compares with an increase of 0.6 degrees during the entire 20th century. So no catastrophe at all. In fact, Mr. Crichton writes about the uselessness of the stupid Kyoto protocols. Anyways, it's useful to know this stuff. The book is fact-based, and it's facts that can help you defeat the inevitable arguments and discussions you will encounter as you get people truly angry when you deny climate change, and you will. People won't debate you and discuss it with you. They won't look at you as an informed citizen who's posing a legitimate scientific inquiry. You are evil by challenging this. That's how you know you're talking about a faith, not science. And by the way, he also speaks in the book quite correctly that one of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century was banning DDT, which was the best defense against malaria-carrying mosquitoes. They reckon about 50 million people had died from malaria unnecessarily because DDT was banned for no reason at all other than this environmental hysteria. The power line scare. Okay, this was during the 80s. They spoke about the dangers of cancer that come from power lines. Totally untrue, completely debunked. The country spent billions of dollars and tremendous loss of property values for no reason other than this religion. So on it goes. And facts are simply not on the side of these folks, but that doesn't matter because they are dangerous fanatics. They are not scientists. They don't care about science. They care about an agenda. And the agenda is one that hurts the United States, although they won't say that. They think it'll help. By the way, you'll also hear nonsensical stories about how if only we will aggressively promote alternative energy sources, will bring prosperity to the country. That's not true. The cost to the country now, because of the insane, hysterical building of windmills and solar voltaic stuff, the cost is enormous. You can figure it out. You don't need to be an economist. It's very simple. If this stuff was economically viable, if it didn't cost money and made money, business would be doing it all on its own. And that's why the government has to give enormous subsidies to people who buy Tesla cars and enormous subsidies to people who put windmills or photovoltaic cells on their properties. Look, we're talking about a religion. You can call it eco-theology. And don't forget that until recently it was all about global warming. And it's now climate change. And you understand the advantages, right? Number one, any occurrence of unusually cold weather is just as much evidence for their worries as warm weather is. So climate change is a brilliant idea. And the truth is climate is always changing, so they must be right? Climate change is a problem. Just look around you. Isn't the climate changing? So, by the way, many of you probably can remember the Ice Age scares, the coming Ice Age. This was heavily promoted in the United Kingdom, but it was also in this country. And we're talking about the 70s here. And on it was going, everything's cooling off. We're going to head into an ice age. It didn't matter that there was no evidence. Faith is a belief that people hold to with no evidence, right? That's what faith is, right? I have no evidence that can prove unequivocally to any human being that God is a reality. I don't believe he is. I know he is. But I can't prove it to you, not in the way we speak of a conventional proof. Ordinarily, I should be able to prove something to you within a few minutes or maybe an hour. To prove the existence of God takes years. Okay, so it's not accepted as proof. So I'm willing to accept that faith means a belief without evidence. And science is exactly the opposite. Science is based on factual analysis. Skepticism is the highest duty of the scientist. Blind faith is an unpardonable sin. And global warming, climate change, environmentalism, it's all blind faith. That's why anyone who questions it is a denier. you got to know that atheism is just as much of a faith as theism, right? If somebody says I'm an agnostic, I just don't know. Maybe God is there, maybe he isn't. I can respect that. But atheism is just as much a faith as Judaism or Christianity is, right? And so to be an obsessive atheist is irrational. It's crazy. Let's try and defeat the destructive dogma of environmentalism. I always insist that your before you change the country, before you get involved in politics, before you try and become a congressman, before you try and do any of those things, you need to take care of your own finances. And the way to do that is by increasing your revenue. Obviously, you've got to diminish debt, you've got to invest wisely, but above all, increase revenue. That's one of the reasons I'm opposed to retiring. There's no reason to stop making money. It's a good thing. But for now, to help you do so, 2 audio programs on special discount on my website at rabbidaniellapin.com. Do us both a favor and get yourself Boost Your Income. That's about an hour teaching. And the second one is Prosperity Power Connect for Success. It's about a 2-hour program, and it's something, by the way, you need to hear more than once, because it's not as if this is a set of information you got to get, right? It's like learning unarmed combat, like judo or jiu-jitsu or karate. You can't just read a book and think you can do it. You got to over and over again, you got to absorb it, you got to practice it again and again and again, so as that it becomes part of you. So as when a bad guy sticks a gun in your spine and asks for your money, you know exactly what to do intuitively. You don't have to think back to what chapter it was that you read it in. For the same reason, I make this material available, discounted right now, on an audio program that you can download, have it with you right away, and start listening to more than once, so that you can absorb it, and so that you start acting intuitively in your business relationships rather than having to try and remember something from a book. The reason that your rabbi, that's me, Rabbi Daniel, and the reason I utterly and completely reject the destructive dogma of environmentalism, climate change, etc., is firstly the facts. The more you delve into the facts, the more obvious it is that they're being manipulated. And secondly, the sheer dishonesty on the other side. It's really easy to see, and I do see it, and I finally also understand the motivation. I get why they're doing it. I see what the agenda is. And the notion that this is objective science and they're just following where the evidence leads, not true at all. They are manipulating and massaging and maneuvering the so-called evidence to come up with a result that says this needs bigger government, more government power and control, more international government and control. These folks just love the United Nations. And so you got to understand that, this whole climate change phenomenon is really nothing but a crusade for more governmental control on every part of life. By the way, as I said earlier, including reproduction. I told you about what's happening in America and England. How's about Australia? The Medical Journal of Australia in 2006, end of 2006, a guy called Professor Barry Walters says that Australia must impose a baby levy of $5,000. You have to pay $5,000 whenever you have a child, followed by an annual tax of $800 per child on every Australian family with more than 2 children. That's what he proposes. He said every newborn baby in Australia represents a major source of greenhouse gas for an average of 80 years, not just by breathing, but by the profligate consumption of resources typical of our society. I mean, just listen to the suicidal self-hatred from Professor Walters. Childbearing is unfriendly behavior for the environment. It's funny, though, because Australia's replacement rate, its fertility rate is like well below 2% anyway, so I don't quite know what he thinks he's doing. But look, I told you in Britain, there's even more going on there. There's something called the Optimum Population Trust, and they also speak about the energy consumption. Again, consumption of energy, by the way, is an old religious theme. and I've spoken about that in an earlier podcast. Prometheus in Greek legend stood as the foundation of contemporary environmental views of energy, namely it's not to be used, standing in sharp contrast to the Judeo view of energy, which is it is a gift from God. You choose which one makes more sense. How about Californians for Population Stabilization? What an organization is that? Global warming is a very serious problem, they say, but it's a subset of the overpopulation problem. The problem isn't just too many people, but it's too many Americans. That's how these people talk. The Huffington Post in 2007 had an article by Dave Johnson, and he writes, let me quote you from this. I couldn't believe this stuff. One solution to the crisis of a heating up globe is for people to stop having so many babies. We've already used up the fisheries. The cattle being raised to feed so many meat eaters is as big a problem as the cars we're all driving. So, what does he want us to do? The Sierra Club, by the way, they got loads of stuff on their website. The population explosion has severely disturbed the ecological relationships between human beings and the environment. In recognition of the growing magnitude of this conservation issue, the Sierra Club supports a greatly increased program of education on the need for population control. Right? They like controlling us, the left. You thought the Sierra Club was just helpful for people who like hiking in the outdoors. No, they have an agenda. They're part of this whole thing. National Park Service, by the way, had a biologist, an employee of the government National Park Service, quoted in the Los Angeles Times in 1989. Let me quote you his words. Human happiness and certainly human fecundity are not as important as a wild and healthy planet. I know social scientists who remind me that people are part of nature, but that isn't true. We have become a plague upon ourselves and upon the earth. Until such time as humans should decide to rejoin nature, some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along. You get it? And a government employee hopes for people to die from a virus so the planet can be saved. I mean, you've got to know what this stuff is all about. How about that great hero Jacques Cousteau? I mean, I love the ocean, I love boating, I love skin diving, scuba diving. But Jacques Cousteau wrote in 1991, again, easy to find quote, in order to stabilize world population, we must eliminate 350,000 people a day. It's a horrible thing to say, but it's just as bad not to say it. It's unbelievable. Jacques Cousteau didn't say exactly how he wants to wipe out a third of a million of people a day. Look, these guys, the environmentalists, make preposterous predictions, and they love to cause panic, and they don't tell you what their real intentions are. Al Gore, when he got that stupid Nobel Peace Prize that Obama also got, this is from his speech. We have begun to wage war on the earth itself. Our trashing of the ozone layer will cause sea levels to rise by 20 feet in this century. It's incredible stuff. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times goes on and on and on about frozen sea ice in the Arctic Circle is vanishing. Okay, it's not true. It's simply not true. Brazil's weather center, it's called Metsal, states that the Arctic ice cap is within 1% of the winter norm, and ice on the southern polar ice cap has grown substantially compared to last year. The vanishing polar bear? Not true! It's simply not true. William Gray of Colorado State University is a guy who believes the Earth will actually start to cool within the next 10 years. Neil Frank, who used to be a director of the National Hurricane Center, calls global warming a hoax. So please don't think we're not alone in rejecting this dangerous nonsense. Richard Lindzen, Lindzen, is a professor of meteorology at MIT, right, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and in Boston, near Boston. He says Europe was far warmer in the Middle Ages than it is today. But in the 17th century, it was much colder. The Thames used to freeze over in London in the winter, right? The Earth changes its temperatures. It warms and cools in cycles. By the way, the number of polar bears, 60 years ago, they estimated there were about 5,000 polar bears. Now, 25,000. Greenland, the temperature in Greenland is lower now than it was in 1940. What's there to say about all this stuff? You can find this stuff as easy as I could. I just wanted to gather together a bunch of it for the purpose of the show to just let you know that, please, I'm not a lone lunatic when I tell you that the whole climate change movement is a fraud. I'm simply not. I'm not alone at all. And just look out for them now, and don't take any of the stuff on faith. It is not science. It is a religion. It really is. And you got to know that they are truly trying to hurt the West. They are trying to hurt America. And there is an entire agenda here that we have to understand, and we have to know what they really are planning to do with us. It's pretty amazing. Paul, a respect for nature, a theory of environmental ethics. He speaks about the need for a lot of people to die. We have no problem in principle with humans reducing their numbers by killing one another. It's an excellent way of making humans extinct, says one organization here. This stuff is pretty grotesque, I have to tell you. Anyways, there's more of it than I have time to even tell you about today. But I just want to wrap up by saying this stuff has been going on for a long time. The Bible in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 5, you shall destroy their altars and break down their images and cut down their idolatrous trees. In Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 21, you shall not plant an idolatrous tree near the altar of the Lord thy God. In other words, Deuteronomy is pointing out that people do have an instinctive desire to worship trees. Isn't that the situation now? What's recycling all about? Right? Why are they on about recycling? You know why? Because paper uses up trees. So what? Plant trees and harvest them. So what? They don't want trees to die. They worship trees. It's irrational, but that's what's really going on. There's a guy called Sir James Fraser, wrote a book at the end of the 19th century. The book was published around about 1900. It's called The Golden Bough. 12 volumes. And it's a book I purchased and keep because it shows how many of the old religions and cults of humanity are rooted in idolatry, in other words, in a rejection of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His book, The Golden Bough, speaks about how sacred trees were common among ancient Germans. Tree worship, these are his words, tree worship is hardly extinct among their descendants at the present day. He wrote that in 1900. I could say it true today. The Green Party in Germany worships trees. There's nothing changed. This is something built into us. We all have a need, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, just as we have a need for water and air, we have a need to believe in something. Once you reject the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, once you reject a biblical vision, the odds are that sooner or later you will adopt a pantheistic religious vision, a worship of nature. It's kind of interesting that at the beginning of Genesis, God speaks about the creation of everything, but nowhere does it say he created the environment or he created nature. In fact, the word nature in Hebrew, hateva, doesn't even exist anywhere in the 5 books of Moses, because as soon as you treat all the details of nature, the rivers and the mountains and the animals and the trees and the sunflowers and everything else, once you wrap it all up and you call it nature or the environment, you are setting yourself up for worship. And that's why Maimonides, one of the great transmitters of ancient Jewish wisdom, lived 1135 to just after 1204, I think. Maimonides writes about how in the time of Abraham, the reason that Abraham was attacked and threatened and assaulted was precisely because he challenged the pantheism of the day. Nature worship. Nature worship and environmentalism, exactly the same thing, excepting the power that we have given the idolaters today to strip our freedoms and threaten our lifestyles. That is far more dangerous today than it was in Abraham's time. But that was what was going on. You've got to recognize environmentalism as a faith. It possesses an irrational hatred of heretics. It's utterly indifferent to cost and sacrifice. All right, just the same way as religious Jews and religious Christians follow the dictates of our faiths. We don't worry about how much it costs. We don't worry about the sacrifices involved. That's exactly how environmentalists feel. Doesn't matter what the cost is. Doesn't matter what the sacrifice. By the way, they love forming congregations, don't they? And they also appoint high priests, the people who teach everyone else the beliefs and doctrines of the faith of environmentalism. It also seeks converts by very aggressive proselytizing and harsh treatment of heretics. And it has its Yom Kippur, it has its special Day of Atonement, its special holy day of the year. That's right, Earth Day, 22nd of April, 1970 was the very first one, the birthday of Vladimir Lenin, and that brings us full cycle and as far as we can go today. Have I got much more to tell you about this? About another 2 hours worth, I would say, at least. But not going to be doing it for now, to your great relief, I am certain. Meanwhile, thank you for listening. Thank you for passing the word, and please do more of that as well. Just keep getting the word out on this podcast. I appreciate it. It'll be good for you. It lets me do a better show, and it's good for the folks who enjoy it. People who don't enjoy it won't listen to it, no problem. But no harm in letting people know about it. Do that, and I appreciate it. My website, rabbidaniellapin.com. The products, the resources available to you on special discount now, 2 audio programs, a shorter one called Boost Your Income, a longer one called Prosperity Power. Go to rabbidaniellapin.com and you'll be able to read about them there and go ahead and simply get them for you or for somebody else. And that brings us to the end of today's show. Until we are together again next week, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you have a week of good health and prosperity. I'm Rabbi Daniel Lapin. God bless you.